Hello, everybody. I have my coffee as usual. I'm here outside the Motor City, in Detroit, the Straits, with my best buddy here, Douglas Gabriel, my greatest teacher and my greatest student all at one time.
It's an honor to be part of the Bolo Club. I just want to say that.
We let you eavesdrop on a conversation that's been going on for 45 or 50 years here. And this is the fourth installment of our current adventure, which is what is cosmic intelligence? And I guess the simplest thing I could say about cosmic intelligence, just to lead in, and I'm going to let Doug run with it for a little bit to see what I can come up with in response to, he's like, you never know what he's going to come up with, but our pieces of the puzzle tend to fit together without planning. So this ought to be interesting. But the thing I can say about cosmic intelligence, it's that form of human consciousness that is looking toward the future. Douglas, how are you there?
I'm doing great, John, and thank you for inviting me to the show today. We've been talking about cosmic intelligence, but today we're going to get truly cosmic.
Well, when I started entertaining this subject, I thought about, well, who are the custodians karmically of the principles of cosmic intelligence? And of course, there's Parsifal, the great initiate Parsifal of the 9th century. But people don't frequently consider the significance of his mother, Herzaloida, which means heart's sorrow. And so I started digging into that. It's something which I greatly enjoy because it's a theme I pursued for, well, since the 70s, as you know, Douglas. And somewhere around here, I have the biography of Tycho de Brahe, but I can't find it. And that book is so obscure that I can't imagine I loaned it to anybody. Did I loan it to you?
His dwarf probably ran off with it.
Yeah, his dwarf Jep. Yeah. But Tycho de Brahe is an interesting individual in that he was a mentor of Johannes Kepler. And Kepler was a very, he was one of the poorest of people. But he was working on astronomy and meanwhile, Tycho de Brahe, who's contemporary with Rudolf II, Emperor Rudolf von Habsburg, and also King James I of England, back in the late Shakespearean era. So this is interesting territory which we're exploring here. But Tycho de Brahe himself, he had a brass nose, or some say gold.
Golden nose, yeah.
Golden
tipped his nose, got cut off in a
duel.
Yeah.
And he had it tied onto his face. But there's a biography floating around somewhere in this house called Uraniborg.
Mm-hmm.
And it's named after the island that belonged to Tycho de Brahe. And James I, the King of England, traveled there with his new bride, and he was smart enough to be able to understand many of the things that Tycho de Brahe was up to. But Rudolf Steiner makes a point in volume 4 of the Karmic Relationship series, 8-volume set, which is really kind of the culmination of Rudolf Steiner's personal task, in that he was so busy for so much of his life completing tasks that should have been done by other people. It wasn't until toward the end of his life that he was able to get to his personal challenge, and that was to reintroduce the concepts of reincarnation and karma into Christianity. So, well, why am I mentioning Herzleute, Heart's Sorrow, and Tycho de Brahe? Well, in that series, in Volume 4, Rudolf Steiner mentions that it's the reincarnation of the same individual, and that he is a key for understanding the Michaelic stream of cosmic Christianity, that he's one of the custodians of that impulse. And it stems back to his earlier incarnation, where he was incarnated as Emperor Julian, who's an interesting individual in that he was involved in the whole chaos, really, that happened after the death of Constantine, who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But yet, Constantine's approach to Christianity didn't have sufficient sincerity to convince Emperor Julian. He went to Ephesus and regions in the Asia Minor, at the western end of Asia Minor, and he spent a good 6 years studying Greek philosophy. And he ended up becoming initiated into the remnants of the mysteries that existed from the ancient world. And he wrote a document that is not seen too common, but it's two orations of the Emperor Julian, one to the sovereign son, and also, and the other is to the mother of the gods. And this is a translation by Thomas Taylor, and which has an interesting history itself. This was a limited reprint of 500 copies in 1922. It created a big controversy. Most of the printing of it was destroyed. But my friend Donald Weiser owned Weiser's Books in New York, got a phone call, and they told him they found a bunch of books that he might be interested in. And he went, and in the basement of this house, there was this pile of these slipcases that were all water damaged and screwed up. I mean, really bad. And he opened one up, and it was those two volumes. So it was a slipcase edition of Thomas Taylor's translations of the writings of Emperor Julian. And so I used to get those from Donald, and he gave me a really good price. And I gave a set to Werner Gloss, which, when you should have seen the look on his face when he opened it and saw what it was. That was worth it right there, just to see him go into shock. Because, well, why do I say that? Well, because there's two basic sides to the Christian stream. There's that side that's very comfortable living within the Christian tradition in the West. And then there's that other side that harkens back more to the pre-Christian mysteries that were really prophetic of the Christian stream outside of the Old Testament. And so you have ancient Egypt and ancient Persia and ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and all these various traditions had a prophetic relationship to the Christ impulse, and some of them coming as a more cosmic Christianity. And so I thought it'd be nice if Douglas and I could get into exploring some of the avenues of understanding the nature of the threefold sun.
Yes, also you suggested for today's talk that we look at Steiner's lectures, Universe, Earth, and Man, which was in 1908, and particularly the one that I'm going to focus on, and I want to read a few paragraphs from, is the one called Man's Connection with the Various Planetary Bodies, the Earth's Mission. But before I do, I just want to point out what Marie Steiner said in the introduction, because it's apropos. The mission of our age is to bring forth not an ancient wisdom, but a new wisdom, one that points not only to the past, but that works prophetically into the future. And that's the beauty of Rudolf Steiner, to take, the wisdom of the Kyriotidis, the wisdom of Sophia, and to turn it into something that is appropriate for our time. And when we talk about cosmic wisdom, we're talking also about the process of initiation. And there is so much nonsense out there about these things that today I hope to go into the three basically higher steps of thinking, feeling, and willing, which Rudolf Steiner called imagination, inspiration, and intuition. And in Universe, Earth, and Man, in Lecture 8, he clearly spells out one of the more profound things that anyone could say about imagination, inspiration, and intuition. And then later, I'm going to be quoting from my favorite author, Novalis, also Emerson, and also an author whose pen name is A.E., George William Russell, on this concept of imagination, inspiration, intuition, and then going into the fourth stage that I would say also then arises once you have a full understanding, which is very hard to attain, by the way, of imagination, inspiration, intuition, is then the whole idea of what is the conscience of the human being, because one could say that the conscience of the human being is in fact the divine that is in us. So I want to read what Rudolf Steiner says here as a foundation from which to build. Quoting from Lecture 8, Rudolf Steiner tells us, "Herein we see how universe and earth, how fixed star and planet are spiritually in touch with each other, and we learn not only to look at what is in our environment in the physical world, but we also gain an inkling of how those who partake in inspiration ascend to the sun. There is still a higher state of consciousness, which in the true sense of the word we call intuition. Through it, humanity can creep within the very nature of things. This is more than inspirational consciousness. Here, a person sinks themselves into beings and identifies themselves with those beings. This leads humanity still further. Where does inspirational consciousness lead humanity? It leads humanity to where they feel at one with the planet Earth, for the egos of the planets are in the center of the Earth. When humanity perceives the sun's tone, they become one with the planetary being that dwells in the center of the Earth. They become one with the planets, and thus can also become one with all other beings. Humanity can then go through experiences that reach far beyond our solar system. Their vision is extended from solar system consciousness to cosmic consciousness, known as intuition, which carries them beyond the several solar systems. Thus, we see that in the mineral kingdom we have something which is a homogeneous form, furnishes us with a basis that extends far beyond our ordinary consciousness. We see that the present human form is a physical earthly form, but that humanity will raise themselves once more from ordinary earthly consciousness to planetary consciousness through imagination, to solar system consciousness through inspiration, to cosmic consciousness through intuition. So there we have imagination, inspiration, intuition. Imagination takes us into the core of the earth, and he says from there you can actually feel what all the plants are being given from the sun and from the other planets. Then when you rise up into the realm of inspiration, you can then experience what we would call the harmony of the spheres, the tone of the sun, and the influence, the cosmic influence coming in from the entire solar system. But if you can And I'm going to point out in a minute, Novalis says, if you can go far above or far within, you can then go into the realm of intuition. And at that point, you can go literally, and this is the only place I know where he says it, and that's why I'm really glad you pointed out we should look at Universe, Earth, and Man lecture series as we talk about cosmic consciousness. He says literally you can then go to the several solar systems beyond our own solar system. Usually he says the human mind cannot do that. Now, let's just take one step at a time. And first, I want to characterize a little bit and then have you say a few things about it. And then I'm going to come back to some quotes from Novalis, A.E., and Emerson. But when we're talking about this, we're talking about the physical, etheric, and the astral. So the imagination is opened up in the astral. The inspiration that Steiner speaks about is opened in the etheric body. And intuition is open through the physical body. So let's just look at imagination. One might think, oh, imagination, that's like fantasy. He says it's the opposite of fantasy. These are real beings, angel beings, connected to all other angel beings. There is no such thing as independent knowledge or independent intelligence. No, all intelligence that is real is connected to other intelligence. So if you meet one angel, you have the possibility, and you probably will, meet the other angels that are connected there. And this may sound trite, but let me just explain it a little bit further, and then let's discuss this. He says that when you enter into this astral realm, the astral light, the realm of imagination, the realm of the angels, everything is upside down, backwards, and inside out. Humans aren't very good at doing things backwards, upside down, and inside out. And so when they tell you, oh, I see your aura, I can reach into the Akashic records. I just read a whole book upon someone who thinks that they can teach people to read the Akashic records. Are they out of their mind? You have to basically die to reach into the realm of intuition. You have to go beyond anything that a human mind can conceive of, and you must go inside to the wisdom that was implanted there by the beings of wisdom in your own physical body. So when you go into the astral light, if you haven't tamed your astral body, you're just going to see demons. You're going to see the bardo. You're going to see the three beings who stand at the threshold. And it is not a pretty picture, and most people can't endure it for 1 second. So when they say someone says they're clairvoyant and they can see your aura and this and that and this and that, most of that is sheer nonsense garbage. What we're talking about here is if you saw into the realm of imagination, you would fall down to the ground thinking that you were seeing the divine. And all you really be seeing is the garment of an angel.
Yes. Wow. Douglas, you've never been shy about upholding challenge. And I think that, so if we look at this and you get at some of the themes that we've approached in the past, and I've done on other podcasts to try and make this accessible for people. So let's do that here, because what he has said is so profound, and then you have to say, well, what does that mean to me? Well, the spirit self is the center of tin. So you could think of the tin trader Joseph of Arimathea, right? And how he traveled with Mary Magdalene and taking the Grail to the islands in the west. But if you go into in Histoire de Saint Grail, they talk about how he travels from Babylon to Saras. But what is Babylon? Well, at the time that story was written, they were referring to the old city of Cairo in Egypt, and that Saras was this legendary island city, and the name Saracen comes from the city of Saras. So when they refer to the Muslims in the Middle East as Saracens, it's hearkening back to this city of Saras, whatever it may be, and it's never really been nailed down, but the image, the archetypal image is very important. And so you see that you have the two-petal lotus, which is the center of tin. And Joseph of Arimathea was a tin trader. And you get into, that's the realm of imagination, right? That's that first realm. That's the realm of the Holy Spirit. When you begin to have a relationship to the supersensible realm, it comes through the Sophia principle, as it's called in Gnosticism, or manas in the theosophical parlance, or the spirit self, as Rudolf Steiner calls it in anthroposophy. Now, when you get to the next center down here, the 16-petaled lotus of the throat, then you have entered into the realm of inspiration. And this is angelic, this is archangelic, right? And so when you get into that realm and you have the Eightfold Path of the Buddha, and so you have a lot of imagery associated with that eightfold petal lotus, which has to do with the planet Mars. And in the Grail tradition, you see that Parsifal ends up competing with the Red Knight, and he defeats the Red Knight with his, he's just dressed like a bumpkin, and he ends up defeating this Red Knight, and he takes the Red Knight's armor. So that's kind of the imagery of moving into that realm. Because of his purity in possession of the human faculty of conscience, he's able to conquer the Red Knight, which represents the lower aspects of that Mars realm, and that frequently resorts to conflict. It's the realm of the folk souls and all the turmoil that can exist between different groups of people. Now, when you go down to the heart realm, that's the 12-fold petal lotus. That's the realm of the Father. So you have the Holy Spirit, the realm of the Son, the Logos, and then you have the realm of the Father, which is the Atman, which that's the spiritual physical realm, and the most ancient realm, and actually our most direct relationship is our ego, which dwells within the warmth of the blood, which is descended from the proto-physical realm of old Saturn, which is 2 stages back. And so Douglas, you're absolutely right. To get to this realm, to enter into the realm of the archive, it's reserved for only the highest of initiates, so that you get a lot of people talking a lot of things, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, so I tend to stay quiet. But the imagery you're giving is so great, I just want you to continue, and I can add some things further after that.
Yes, you're so right. And I tend to give, the shortcut version of things, and sometimes I'm quite almost abusive of people who wish to spout supposed cosmic intelligence when in fact they're just spouting what they ate for lunch and what their gastrointestinal response to that. So as we're talking about imagination, we could call that clairvoyance. When we're talking, which you pointed out, the brow chakra, when we're talking about the throat chakra, we're talking about clairaudience, speech and hearing the music of the spheres, and that's what Steiner says, and also with the clairvoyance, we could literally enter into the core of the earth and feel what the plants feel from the forces of the sun coming in. So it's somewhat visual, not technically, but one could, in terms of relating it to human senses, one could say one perceives this astral realm in what could be called visions, or we can go into great descriptions of that. These are stages of initiation. They are not just transformations of thinking, feeling, and willing, but they are stages of initiation which literally you have to put your life on the line to even take the first step in this direction. So Rudolf Steiner spoke about imagination in beautiful ways again and again and again, but others spoke about it also. And of course, my favorite author, as I pointed out, Novalis, says this about imagination. And he tends to be astoundingly profound and yet succinct at the same time. So I'd like to read what Novalis tells us about imagination. The imagination places the world of the future either far above us or far below, or in a relation of metempsychosis to ourselves. The depths of our spirit are unknown to us. The mysterious way leads inward. Let me just point out that metempsychosis means basically that's really what people refer to as reincarnation. It means that you transform yourself from one incarnation to the next into a variety of different forms. In other words, we are all forms. We are all things. Just like Steiner says, through imagination, we understand the plant realm. Through inspiration, we understand the realm of the group soul of the animals. And through intuition, we understand the group soul of the minerals. So what he's saying here, Novalis, is that imagination takes us far, far above or far, far below, but it's everything in between. And it tells us who we are in our transformation from one life to the next and how all of these things relate to us. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson is a very profound person, and in his last lectures called The Natural History of the Intellect, if you ever thought you truly understood Emerson, until you read these called The Natural History of the Intellect, his last lectures, you have not actually read his best work. So I recommend them to everyone. And Rudolf Steiner said that, literally, quote, America is to have a different form of anthroposophy, and while it is presently woody and asleep, one should look to Emerson and his friends to understand it. Emerson was far ahead of his time, and he studied all the Eastern philosophies, and he was the first person I know of to ever refer to the being of Ahriman, which is a name taken from ancient Persia for the god of darkness. And he was constantly saying when his joints would hurt or when he felt old, he'd say, Ahriman is coming for me. Ahriman's after me. He always referred to Ahriman, the only person I know, long before Rudolf Steiner ever did. So when you read the Natural History of the Intellect, he goes through and describes a variety of things, and one thing he describes is imagination. And he describes it in such beautiful words that I can say that he and George William Russell, A.E., are just about as profound as what Novalis has to say about it. So please bear with me as I read this paragraph about imagination from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Imagination is a spontaneous act, a perception and affirming of a real relation between a thought and some material fact. Whenever this resemblance is real, not playful, and is deep or pointing at the causal identity, it is the act of imagination. The very design of imagination, this gift celestial, is to domesticate us in another nature. No faculty leads to the invisible world so readily as imagination. Imagination transfigures, so that only the cosmic relations of the object are seen. In other words, he's basically telling us imagination takes us into perception, through perception, to find the true beingness of anything that you wish to understand. And it is a celestial capacity. It is a divine capacity that is, in fact, only alights in us when we understand the true reality of any particular thing. I would have to say that that's just about as profound of a definition that you can reach. But many years ago, when you turned me on to A.E., which is the pen name of George William Russell, and you'd read us in our groups beautiful poetry that he had written, I had to say that I fell in love with his work so much, and it's so profound that I've never ever stopped reading his work. And so I'm going to read two paragraphs of his definition, or not definition, or let us say description of imagination. And the reason is he was a theosophist, and he was a deep spiritual person. You could tell us 1,000 things about him. Just like you were talking about Tycho de Brahe and one of my favorite characters in history, Rudolph II. It was said of Tycho de Brahe that he would be the one who would come to give all answers to the questions of anthroposophy in our time. Well, George William Russell, A.E., also does that, in my opinion, and he was a great artist too. So if you haven't come across his work, you definitely should look him up also. So he says the following about imagination. By imagination, what exists in essence is given a form in thought, and we can contemplate with full consciousness that which hitherto had been unrevealed or only intuitionally surmised. In imagination, there is a revelation of the self to the self, and a definite change in being. Here, images appear in consciousness which we may refer definitely to an internal creator, with power to use or remold pre-existing forms and endow them with life, motion, and voice. The immortal in us has memory of all its wisdom. There is an ancestral wisdom in man, and we can drink that old wine of heaven. This memory of the spirit is the real basis of imagination. And when we speak, and when it, let me read that sentence again. This memory of the spirit is the real basis of imagination. And when it speaks to us, we feel truly inspired, and a mightier creature than ourselves speaks through us, telling us its ancient story as we taste eternity and drink the elixir of immortality. I don't think you could get a better definition or description of imagination. In other words, it's saying that when you arise to imagination, you become a higher being, and higher beings speak through you. And when that happens, then you're endowed with life, motion, and a voice to explain really how the divine interpenetrates the physical world. So whether it's Ralph Waldo Emerson, Novalis, or A.E., they are basically underscoring what Rudolf Steiner tells us about the profound nature of imagination. It cannot be underestimated what this power is all about. And it is clearly described here between the three of them as a path of initiation into the spiritual world.
Kind of caught me on digging up something. Yes, Ralph Waldo Emerson. You know, it's interesting because Rudolf Steiner speaks more glowingly of Ralph Waldo Emerson than any other American that I know of. And Ralph Waldo Emerson is a very interesting individual. He had a group, they called it the Twilight Club, and they would meet in the evening and they would discuss world, religion, and philosophy, and all of these things. And I used to spend many days. You remember, I had next to the long lounge chair that I used to sit in Birmingham was the collected edition of the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, a nice old red hardbound set. But one of the interesting things about Ralph Waldo Emerson is if you study the history of American literature, he's basically the birth of American English. And he gets away from the if you get into the English that's before him, it's still very much tied into the language form of the King James edition of the Bible. So it's got thee and thine and thou and all these types of uses, these archaicisms, and you see them disappear in the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and also with the developments that had happened with Webster's dictionary, and so it's a very interesting the evolution of the spirit of language in America that happened through Ralph Waldo Emerson, so that you could say that he was a representative of the higher aspect of the American folk soul. And I used to have dreams. Douglas and I both managed the Mayflower bookstore at different times. He after me. But I used to, in my dreams, I'd go into the bookstore and I'd look up things and run into people. One day I was in a dream and I turned the corner and I looked down and there sitting on a little stool is Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I said, "Hey, wait a minute. We have your books here." And I go and I grab one of his books and he said, "I've already read it." Well, yeah, Emerson.
That's funny.
Emerson, it's very much tied into Bronson Alcott. And Bronson Alcott was the father of Louisa May Alcott, who's famous for Little Woman and other very important pieces of American literature. But Bronson Alcott was very much a bibliophile. He was a book lover. And he collected Thomas Taylor's translations of the Greek writers. And mind you, Thomas Taylor is an interesting character. They call him Thomas Taylor the Platonist. And people have a hard time understanding the way he was received in England, because you have to keep in mind a great many of the people that were college educated in England, they knew Greek and they knew Latin. So to have an English translation, you could see is very controversial. They could quibble about all manner of things regarding the translation. But Taylor was so dedicated that at home, he and his wife would dress in Greek garb and only speak in ancient Greek. But part of what's most interesting about Thomas Taylor's translations is all the footnotes that he included in his translations. So you have the commentaries of Proclus and Iamblichus and all, Simplicius, Plotinus. He's always weaving it all together as a mystery wisdom, and he's very much sensitive to that. And so that's a big part of the content of which Ralph Waldo Emerson was mining. And he was also, reading what had started to become translated from other religions, in India and in the Middle East. And he was just amazingly widely read for the time. And so articulate, the clarity of his thought, and the clarity of Henry David Thoreau, for that matter. Thoreau's a different thing, because the whole idea of civil disobedience is a concept of Henry David Thoreau, and one time there was a thing that they agreed shouldn't happen, and Henry David Thoreau ended up getting thrown in jail for protesting it, and Emerson went to visit him. He said, "David, what are you doing in there?" And Henry David Thoreau says to Emerson, "What are you doing out there?" So you see that in Thoreau, there's very much this element of the will and Walden Pond and all of that. In fact, years ago, a friend of mine, it was a quest for me to get a set of the works of Henry David Thoreau for a prominent Don Henley, a guy in the Eagles. And he's the guy who went about, I don't know whether he accomplished, he was going to purchase Walden Pond to protect it. But so it's very much part of the warp and woof of American culture, Henry David Thoreau. But try and find his writings. It's very interesting that they're difficult to find. And I guess I also want to mention Thomas Johnson, who was in Missouri, your home state. And his papers are all collected at the university there in Missouri. And he had a publication he printed called The Platonist. And he would stick in there translations of the Neoplatonic authors, the Greek writers. And so that was all a part of the mix that was going on in formulating a more universal, shall we say, cosmic Christianity. That was what was kind of the bedrock of American transcendentalism. And then when you get to the work of Rudolf Steiner, it's fascinating to me that the anthroposophy or spiritual science of Rudolf Steiner was first picked up by musicians in New York.
That's fascinating. Yes, and Stuart Weeks, I'm sure you know him. He still continues that tradition. There in literally down the street from where Emerson lived, and it's just remarkable when you think about the last lectures of Emerson, these letters on natural history, because until then he said a lot of tremendously wise things, but then he puts it all into one place. I actually took the entire set of lectures, condensed them, and produced a little book on them and sent it out, basically their selections. And I would have to say that it is one of the most profound things ever written in English. And it is yet to truly be recognized by scholars because they don't know that it even exists. I believe it was David Wood and some others who found it, brought it forth not too long ago, and they were anthroposophists. And Stuart Weeks continues that tradition. Well, continuing on with that, when we realize that imagination is that first step and that it takes you to the threshold, and when you go to the threshold, you're going to see three nasty, ugly beings. And they are your evil thinking, your evil feeling, and your evil willing that has yet to be digested. You won't get across the threshold until you do digest it because you can't take anything but, as you pointed out, monastic thinking, higher thinking from the spirit that is really spirit self type thinking that comes from the spiritual aspect of the consciousness soul. So when that is developed, you have to exercise your capacities of thinking before you can actually enter into the realm of imagination. And imagination is not, as we pointed out, some simple term that refers to picture consciousness, though in fact it has everything to do with picture consciousness. Today's world has supplanted clairvoyance, clear seeing, clairvoyance, with watching television, watching your screen, watching the images go by. This is really the antithesis. It is the anti-human form of what is supposed to become an angelic capacity in the human being through imagination. So we cannot just set it aside saying, oh yes, imagination is easy to attain. It is not. If you are not willing to give up of all of your unresolved thinking, you cannot attain true stages of imagination. So oftentimes people say, well, what's Rudolf Steiner's answer on that? And they make the joke, well, it's imagination, intuition. I. Well, what are the three I's? There are actually three I's. The I am in the soul realm only becomes eternal when you begin to consider things of the realm of imagination. And that can be carried into future incarnations or metempsychosis, as Novalis tells us, that imagination, once we understand it, shows us who we are, who we have been, who we will be, our highest and our lowest. And so I don't wish to jump immediately into inspiration and intuition and then move on to conscience until we first literally give a proper due to the first stage of initiation called imagination. But again, going back to Emerson, I'd like to read a very short quote of Emerson on inspiration. And again, as you pointed out, you really cannot underestimate the power, the wisdom, the thinking capacity of Emerson. Wasn't he, John, one of the first people to translate most of the books of the East? People didn't even know about Buddhism. They didn't know about reincarnation. He was one of the very first people to bring this to his circle of transcendentalists. And then from them, all kinds of inspiration arose. So here's what he says about inspiration. Inspiration is very coy and capricious. We must lose many days to gain an inspiration, and in order to win infallible verdicts from the inner mind, we must indulge and humor it in every way. We know vastly more than we can digest. Happy beyond the common lot if he learns the secret that besides the energy of his conscious intellect, his intellect is capable of new energy by abandonment to a higher influence, by unlocking at all risks his human doors and suffering the inundation of the ethereal tides to roll and circulate through him. This ecstasy the old philosophers called an inebriation, and said that intellect, by its relation to what is prior to intellect, is a god. Nothing can be done except by this inspiration. Let me just summarize that in my own very simple terms. He's saying that you become inebriated with the divine to receive inspiration, and that when you do, as is insinuated by A.E., you're drinking the wine of the heavens, the soma, he refers to it as, and that this is done intuitionally through imagination, that you open yourself up as a vessel, as a grail, to the spiritual world to be filled by inspiration. As anyone knows who's ever had an inspiration, it may only last a nanosecond, but it may inspire you for the rest of your life. Many people may only have a few inspirations in their entire life, but when they do, they never forget it, and it always has a certain characteristic. And that characteristic, first off, may come with many pictures, but it comes with a sounding. It comes with, it could be a voice. It comes with a full perception of all 12 senses at once. And when that happens, that cannot be put into words. As a matter of fact, as Emerson tells us, when that happens, we become a god. We actually take on into ourselves our own divine nature. And how does that happen? As he says, you have to suffer many, many a day before you have that one speck, that one moment of inspiration. And from that, you can build who you're going to be in the future, as we would say, as an archangelic being, because now, through inspiration, you enter into the realm of the harmony of the spheres. You enter the realm of the archangels, the realm where the sounding of nature begins to echo in your heart. But it really, of course, we have, as you've pointed out, imagination is on the brow, inspiration is through the throat, but the throat is also speech, but it's also hearing, according to Rudolf Steiner. They're connected. And so when you have an inspiration, it will fill you with a sound. It will fill you with many pictures oftentimes, but it will also then give you the power to speak. It is more or less like the Pentecostal fire that comes down, that came down upon the apostles. And when that happened, what did they have? The capacity to speak in a language that everyone could understand. So inspiration sometimes can't be put into words, but it might be put into art. It might be put into sculpture, into the architecture. It can be put into many, many things. But one thing is for sure, it has a beauty to it that is profound. It has a connectivity that takes whatever that inspiration is and connects it not only to the spiritual world, to angels and to archangels, but then it has a specific earmark. And that earmark is become even more profound when it turns into an intuition. But generally, it makes you feel as though you are filled with love and that you need to share this inspiration with others so that they can have this experience of truth, beauty, and goodness, as it were, as the Greeks would call it. So inspiration, again, you may have to sweat blood before you can actually have a true inspiration. So it isn't what people just refer to commonly, like commonly referring to imagination when they're really referring to fantasy, referring to inspiration as a good idea. No, inspiration is something that moves your soul so profoundly that it becomes an eternal impress of the spiritual world. As a matter of fact, Rudolf Steiner describes it as when you reach this stage of initiation, it becomes beyond terrifying, because what you experience, you know, you can never do justice to trying to share that inspiration with anyone else. But you could work your whole life to try to manifest something that would indicate that inspiration. He also says that the archangels, when they come in during inspiration, literally chew upon you. They eat you. They consume you. And you're happy about it, which is a very strange thing. But he also says that when we cut the grass rejoices. When we literally take the life of anything in nature, it's a rejoicing. So when we can be imbibed by the spiritual world, at the same time, the inspiration is a return. It is a nutrition that is given, like the dew of heaven, like the soma, like the elixir of life, as Novalis referred to it. It is a nourishment that is beyond imagination. It is beyond hearing the harmony of the spheres. And as Rudolf Steiner said in the first quote, imagination takes us to the core of the earth, what people would call today the living being of Gaia, even though it's beyond that. And that you would understand then how the plants feel in relationship to being nourished by the sun. When you enter into the realm of inspiration, you enter into a solar system consciousness. In other words, what the sun and the 6 planets all do together in their beautiful balance, in their beautiful power, in their virtues, in their dominion, in their wisdom, in their form, all of those things then fill you, and the harmony of the spheres, as Pythagoras called it, sounds inside of you. And then you realize that inside of you is a replica of our solar system. The heart is the sun, and the organs beneath the ribs of the chest. Those are the organs that replicate the motion and the sound and the resonance of the planets. So inspiration takes us into this realm, the second realm of initiation, that then allows us the chance to be filled by capacities far, far beyond human capacities. And those may only last for a very, very short second, but they can inspire you for the rest of your life.
Wonderful. Yes, and if you look at the work of Rudolf Steiner, you can be assured that he's always taking things and then he'll approach it from another vantage point and then from a different vantage point, so that he doesn't define things. He approaches things from different vantage points, and that enables you to try and live into what he's describing. And so he's very clear. He says that it's of more value, and I'm paraphrasing, it's of more value to read one lecture, 100 times than it is to read 100 lectures one time. And so what is he getting at there? That there's just this reality that lives behind the world, behind the words. The mystery of the word is the mystery of the logos. That's the mystery of Christ. And so our friend James Stewart over at the Rudolf Steiner Archive, he brought up a quote of Steiner's recently in a posting on in social media, and it was interesting because he didn't give the reference, but he said Rudolf Steiner said that the other Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, are descriptions of journeys up the mountain, and that the Gospel of John is depicted from the top of the mountain looking down. And so it's very clearly the Gospel of John represents an initiation document, and that taken with the other writings of John, such as the book of Revelation, those are testimonies to the fact of that St. John the Divine was a profound initiate, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that he had gone through the most profound initiation of the male disciples around Jesus Christ. And so when you get into looking at this more closely and take some of the things that Rudolf Steiner said, he said that if you accomplish the goal of transformation, and this is essentially what it is, because these higher principles that we developed have to do with taking our fourth principle, our ego, and being able to work into the astral, the etheric, and the physical. And in working into these, there are gifts that result: imagination, inspiration, and intuition. But there's also other aspects of that come about. He says that if you accomplish the challenge of imagination, that gives you access into life before birth, and that you can develop a relationship to that. And that if you get into the realm of inspiration, that'll give you access to your previous incarnations. And if you get into the realm of intuition, that gives you access to all of the incarnations of the Earth evolution, going all the way back from old Saturn, old Sun, old Moon, and then our present Earth is the fourth stage in a series of 7. And so you see that you have this whole mystery that's portrayed there. But he also says that likewise, the post-Atlantean periods, the first of which is the Old Indian, the second is the Old Persian, the third is the Egypto-Chaldean, and the fourth is the Greco-Roman period. But you see that he says that the Old Indian period harkens back to when the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon were all together as one community, so to speak. And that because certain higher beings needed a new arena to be able to bring about what they were to unfold, the Sun separated from the Earth, Moon complex. And the spirits of form were key in that regard. But one spirit of form laid within the earth. That's Jehovah Elohim, and he ended up separating the moon from the earth. And so you have this tripartite mystery going on there. Now, if you look at that more closely, you'll see that the post-Atlantean periods are recapitulation of those mysteries. So when the sun, the moon, and the earth were all united together, that's recapitulated in the Vedic wisdom of Stone Age India. And then you see the sun separating from the earth and moon. So you have earth, moon together, and the sun separates. That's the old Persian. And then you see the moon separating from the earth, and that's recapitulated in the Egypto-Chaldean period, right? And then you get to the fourth, and the fourth, that's the incarnation of the Logos, the incarnation of Christ at the turning point of time. And fourth stages don't have recapitulations. And then you get into the period 5, that's the period of the intellectual soul, and then you get into the consciousness soul, and we don't have a recapitulation. We're a fifth period. We're about developing something new. And that's being able to move towards developing the fifth principle. That's the Sophia principle. That's that manas, that higher mind. And in the average individual, Madame Blavatsky says, as far as reincarnation is concerned, only the essence of manas is that which is involved in the continuation of reincarnation. So that you see, we're involved in a perfecting of vehicles. So through the perfection of our relationship to the astral body brings about the manas, and the perfection of the ego into the etheric body brings about that life spirit, that Buddhic principle. And the highest stage, of course, is to be able to start to transform the actual physical vehicle. That gives us access to the whole history of the solar system.
Beautifully said, John. In Steiner's teachings, of course, he always refers to this as moral imagination, moral inspiration, and moral intuition or moral technique, and that these three stages of initiation always must be accompanied with moral activity. In other words, what I was referring to as the courage to bring back what it is you see in imagination, inspiration, or intuition into courageous deeds of love created out of complete freedom. And this is the higher capacities that our authors I'm quoting here today are making reference to. Now, as we talk about intuition, people might not understand that intuition, as you pointed out, comes out of the heart. But we begin the path of initiation in thinking, and then we have to control our speech, and then we have to control our actions. And that those actions through intuition would be called moral technique. How do you have the moral impulse to know that your intuition is correct and that it needs to be put into action? If you had an intuition that didn't give you the moral courage to act out of freedom and love, then it wasn't an intuition. And intuition, by its own definition, is always correct. It is a knowing that is far beyond what any human or even angel or even an archangel could fully experience. Only an archai, a being, a time spirit, a zeitgeist, could in fact have a true moral intuition that could then move into a human being. And when that happens, you have the forces that have created history. You have people who, through their intuition, knew that what they were doing was absolutely right. This, again, can only be faced with astounding courage to look at yourself and your doppelganger, your double, your evil thinking, feeling, and willing, and to eradicate them from every motivation you have to try to penetrate into the spiritual world through these three stages of initiation. I'd like to quote here from A.E., George William Russell, on intuition. And then I would like to close and then make sure that I get this last quote in, because it is from a book that you always used to read to us. John always had the capacity to pull a book off the shelf and turn it to the exact page of what he wanted to read to us. And the story of the blue flower from Heinrich von Offendinger, written by Friedrich von Hardenberg, who was called Novalis. So this story called Heinrich von Offendinger is a novel that was written in response to Goethe's novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. But it's an initiation novel, and in it he speaks of conscience. And the reason I'm going to relate to conscience is because conscience is what happens when you have an intuition. The ancient Greeks used to believe that if you did something wrong, the Furies would chase you, the three Furies, until you had resolved your evil deed. Eventually, through Sophocles and through drama, the Furies were turned into what are called the Orestes. In other words, a force in the human body, and in this particular case, Steiner refers to the force of the pressure of blood on the kidneys as that which reminds you of conscience, whether what you did was good or bad. And so we know when you are going through these three stages of initiation that as you commit an action, you should be able to see the karmic consequences of it. And that's what the Furies, who turned into the Orestes, was all about. Are your actions loving and kind? Can you, through imagination and inspiration, understand the karma of your deeds? That is what intuition is all about. And by the way, he says to reach this, you have to die completely to yourself. So to reach the Akashic Chronicles, the Akashic Records, the true realm of intuition, the realm of the archai, you would have to kill your lower self and only have that which is eternal become the receptive vehicle for the intuition which would then inspire you to take action. And you have to take action if you receive a true intuition. So that's what conscience is all about. And conscience is really God on earth acting through us. But AE tells us that when we are talking about intuition, he describes it in this way. Intuition is that sense of a divinity ever present in act or thought that my words do not communicate. The ecstatic, half-articulate, broken words can make us feel the kingdom of heaven is within us. Earth seems to me bathed in an ether of deity. Thought, from wherever it sets out, forever leads to the heavenly city. But these feelings are incommunicable. We have no words to express 1,000 distinctions clear to the spiritual sense. Everything in nature has intellectual significance, and relation as utterance to the thought out of which the universe was born. And we, whose minds were made in its image, who are the microcosm of the macrocosm, have in ourselves the key to unlock the meaning of that utterance. Because of these affinities, the spirit swiftly, by intuition, can interpret nature to itself. I'll just stop there because you had brought up the absolute profound concept of the word. And when we're talking about imagination, we're talking about light ether. When we're talking about inspiration, we're talking about sound ether. And when we're talking about intuition, we're talking about life ether, or is also called the word ether, the logos. And I'll save the last quote until we get further along in our conversation. But I would have to say that what we're talking about today is the true way, with proper respect, to address these things. Because to address them in any superficial fashion, as we just heard in these descriptions by these great authors, would actually be an insult to the spirit.
Yeah, my greatest consternation is my lack of worthiness. I'm just the bumpkin, and I got to go fight the Red Knight. It's like, and I got a stick, and he's got a sword and armor and the whole deal, and it's almost insurmountable. It can be so overwhelming when you face that you are the Red Knight. And the Red Knight you have to slay is that lower triad, that you should have accomplished already, the lower chakras. And now you're working on from the heart chakra up in your unfoldment to be truly human. And this harkens back to a quote that I think is one of Rudolf Steiner's most succinct regarding this. And it was back in May 31st of 1908. And I've shared it on another podcast, but it's so important, I have to share it again, because I keep reading it over and over. He says, and I quote, "One says a lot about wisdom, but wisdom isn't what's often called wisdom today. One gets smart through experience, but wisdom is the force that streams into us from the spiritual world and then streams out again. Wisdom also comes from the mouth of babes. When what streams out comes more from the feeling, it's wisdom. But when it stimulates a man into action so that productivity predominates, it's love. But one has to know what love really is. Someone may feel sympathy for a man's misfortune, but that isn't real love. Sympathy only becomes love if one steps in and helps him. Wisdom and love make up the I. The I is love and wisdom that have become will. This is the higher triad."
Amen. I mean, what can you say after that? That's exactly right. And then conscience comes in. Because if you act out of love and wisdom, then you actually know at that moment when you take the action, because love is an action, love is not a feeling. And wisdom is the action of the spiritual world that has manifest and is manifesting. And so when you take these actions of love out of freedom, you know at that moment exactly that the I am is tapping into its eternal nature. That's a wonderful, wonderful quote, John.
And so you get into that and you see that there's a certain pristine quality in the transmittal of what are called the Grail mysteries. And Rudolf Steiner had said in his book called Science that were the work to be given another name, it would be the Holy Grail. And so you see what we have here is a portrayal of the challenge of the universally human. And that which is universally human is the only vehicle by which the Christ principle can unfold. That it's not a revelation for some singular group or these people over here. It's a complete earthly revelation for all mankind. But that we have to understand that people are going to come to that impulse by various diverse avenues, that not everybody's going to take the same path to find the Christ. And in fact, they may not even know the name of Christ by which he's called by most people, specifically in the West. That's not the important thing. The important thing is what that quotation just said, is that the higher triad is love and wisdom that becomes will. And that is the active manifestation of conscience. And when they asked Jesus Christ, how will we know the Christians? He said, you will know them by their deeds. He didn't give them a list of qualifications of scripture, verse, and all of that. It was purely an aspect of being able to integrate with one's earthly life to the point to where your earthly life begins to unfold as a manifestation of the divine spiritual beings, which is unbelievably profound. I mean, I blush at even saying it because, you know, I'm so such a bumpkin in that regard. But nonetheless, for whatever reason, I'm carrying water for my limited understanding of what this might mean. But you see, when you come to understand the mysteries of the Grail and how Rudolf Steiner describes it, and one of our teachers, Rennie Carrito, does a wonderful job in showing how the northeast, west, and south converged onto Chartres Cathedral, and that there came about a synthesis of the ancient mystery wisdom, that Platonic aspect of the mystery wisdom that was so critical at that time. But Rudolf Steiner describes it as a twilight of that impulse. And so you see that there's these earlier impulses running out of their impetus and out of the Grail mysteries of the 9th century is something that's moving into the future. And the reason I brought up Emperor Julian, Hertzleute, and Tycho de Brahe is that's very important in understanding this, because see, Emperor Julian couldn't accept Christianity as it was being presented in the formalized Roman form of Constantine. And so he retreated to the ancient Greek mysteries of Apollo and the threefold sun, and that was still glimmering, and he was able to carry that with him. But he ended up being killed because he, in his writings, revealed some of the secrets of those mysteries. But you see him reincarnating as Hertzleute, the mother of Parsifal in the 9th century. And Herzleute, her husband, took off as a knight and ended up dying. And she had a great mistrust for the wiles of men and all of that. So she was going to shield her son from all these worldly affairs. And so Parsifal was this pure soul. He had not been through any of this indoctrination of the orthodox system of religion and all of that. He had the idea of God, but it was a very pristine, pure, untainted relationship to it. She was very careful. He didn't know about knights. And one day he ran into some knights in the woods and he started asking them, what were they? And they started telling him. And he came back and told his mother, Herzleute, well, he wanted to go be a knight. And so he took off. And that's the approach moving into the future, because he doesn't have any baggage. He's not recapitulating any old themes. He's coming at it out of a purely human realm and out of that dullness that Douglas is talking, the realm of the kidneys, that Tumpheit, that dullness in thinking, and being able to take that Tumpheit and bring it up to blessedness so that it becomes an integrated genuine process that is expressing the intentions of the divine spiritual beings.
It's so true. And that's really, Parsifal is an example of who we all are and who we all need to be. And this path that he followed is this path of conscience, the path of, though he did things incorrectly when he was in ignorance, he eventually became blessed because he took upon himself the karma of his brother and upon himself the karma of the Grail King. Well, Rudolf Steiner talks about Novalis, and if you want to get the best book on that, that would be Sergei Prokofiev's book on Novalis. And he's a very profound being who is directly connected to the Gospels of St. John and the book of Revelation, and the things that we refer to so often as one of the most profound and direct paths for initiation. And since that's what we're talking about today, the 3 stages of initiation, to really study Novalis is tremendous. His book, The Novice of Sayas, I believe, is one of the most beautiful things ever written. But his novel, Heinrich von Oftendingen, is a story of a young man who leaves his home and basically goes off on the path of initiation. And during it, he's having a conversation with someone. And there's also a tremendous fairy tale that's told in it. Klingsor's fairy tale, one of the great mystery writings of our time, that you could spend the rest of your life trying to understand how profound it is. But in this conversation that Heinrich von Oftendingen is having with Sylvester, they discuss conscience. And I'd like to read this quote as my last offering in terms of what arises as the moral impulse of moral imagination, moral inspiration, and moral technique, or moral intuition. So he says, explain to me the nature of conscience. And this is conscience, not consciousness, or conscious. So explain to me the nature of conscience. If I were God, could I do so? For when we comprehend it, conscience exists. Conscience, that sense and world-creating power, that germ of all personality, appears to me like the spirit of the world poem, like the event of the eternal, romantic confluence of the infinitely mutable common life. Conscience appears in every serious perfection, in every fashioned truth. Every inclination and ability transformed by reflection into a universal type becomes a phenomena, a phase of conscience. All formation tends to that which can only be called freedom, though by that is not meant an idea, but the creative ground of all being. To speak accurately, This all-embracing freedom, this mastership of dominion, is the essence, the impulse of conscience. In it is revealed the sacred peculiarity, the immediate creation of personality, and every action of the master is at once the announcement of the lofty, simple, evident world, God's Word. Conscience is the innate mediator of every man. It takes the place of God upon earth and is therefore to many the highest and the final. Conscience is the peculiar essence of man fully glorified, the divine archetypal man. Everything which experience and earthly activity embrace forms the province of conscience, which unites this world with higher worlds. With the loftier sense, religion appears, and what formerly seemed an incomprehensible necessity of our inmost nature, a universal law without any definite intent, now becomes a wonderful, domestic, infinitely varied, and satisfying world, an inconceivably interior communion of all the spiritual with God, and a perceptible, hallowing presence of the only one, or of his will, of his love in our deepest self.
Well, that's kind of a hard act to follow.
That's why I shut up afterwards. Precisely.
Yeah. Well, that, again, when you're confronted with one of the most profound souls that I know of, and that's just my humble opinion, Novalis, I don't know how to tell you, but Douglas and I have been struggling with him, and Goethe, the green snake and the beautiful lily, and the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz for the last 50 years. And these powerful imaginations can give us a storyboard to contemplate this process of gentle transformation that at times can be very challenging. And at this point, I'd like to, before we run out of time here, I wanted to share with you that you should go to Amazon and check out the books by Dr. Douglas Gabriel. There's the Eternal Curriculum for Wisdom Children, Intuitive Learning, and the Etheric Body. That's available on Amazon, as is The Eternal Ethers, a Theory of Everything. And also his wife, his totally industrious wife, Tycho Gabriel, has her Gospel of Sophia series available on Amazon. And I have my own books. They're available on eBay. You can buy them from me directly. And my first volume is The Arcana of the Grail Angel, the spiritual science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And Douglas here wrote the foreword. And it's 640 pages with just tons of diagrams. And the sequel to that is the Arcana of Light on the Path, which has the full series of diagrams that are in the first volume, but there's a whole bunch more additional diagrams. And these diagrams can help one come to an understanding, these Grail diagrams, of all the subjects that we are trying to work through the riddles here. And that these are available. There's links below to get them on eBay, or you can access them through my academia link that's also below on Facebook, and also on YouTube. But other than that, if you want to buy me a cup of coffee, paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. And if you want to buy Douglas a cup of coffee, well, send me a little extra and I'll buy him one. But I wanted to fit those things in there. There's so many things I have to remember. It's really quite a challenge putting all this together because I want to do it justice, and it's hard to get it right every time. But I have a bit of a tailwind, and this gives me nourishment to get me through the week. And we're rendered speechless, and so what more can one say when one starts to enter into the halls of initiation? And these are things that are outlined in Light on the Path, and that was my second volume is concerned with Light on the Path, and that's the path of initiation that Rudolf Steiner first presented when he began his association with the Theosophical Society as the head of the esoteric section, and those profound sayings, which are encoded, the mystery wisdom of the true esoteric stream. Likewise, there's, of course, I always like to mention the Lord's Prayer, which Rudolf Steiner early on pointed out was all this of which we've been discussing is encoded in the Lord's Prayer. So that even if you don't understand it, just by saying the Lord's Prayer, and I've been doing it daily for more years than I can count. I only have 10 fingers, and it's much, much more than it's multiples of that. But I've been doing it for the last, I don't know, maybe 50 years or so. And it works on you and brings you closer to Christ. And that's what I would recommend is to be able to have a sacred space in your life. Burning incense is good. Frankincense and myrrh are the only ones that are really mentioned. There's spikenard, that's mentioned also, and so there's a lot of things that can help bring you into coming into this sacred space. And you want to like not take your baggage with you. You want to try and kind of cleanse your consciousness before you enter into these things, because it is truly sacred, and you don't want to bring all this earthly detritus with you when you cross to the other side. You want to be able to cleanse yourself. And so hopefully our efforts here have given people some ideas to work with where they can come into a closer relationship with this path of riddles that we attempt to lay out here. Douglas, I can't thank you enough. I can't tell you how much I personally enjoy being able to have conversations with you. If for the only reason that you're one of the few people that I could talk to.
It's a beautiful thing. Thank you. I'm always pleased to have a conversation with you, which we've been doing, as you say, for many decades, and we're hopefully going to be continuing to do it for many decades to come.
All right. Bye, everybody.